Good afternoon, everyone. We've got quite a few people joined now, so we'll make a start. Welcome to the Pipeline Industry Guild webinar. My name's David Chodwick. I'm the branch chair, Eastern Branch. Can I ask you to please mute your microphones and turn your cameras off? The webinar is being recorded, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, then please turn your camera off. George will be giving a presentation starting very shortly. We will be doing questions through the chat line, so please post your questions on the chat line. We'll pick those up and I will pose those to George at the end of his presentation. We are fairly constrained with time today, so if there are an awful lot of questions and some of them remain unanswered at the end, then between George, myself and headquarters, we will post answers out to you. So I think that's covered everything on the intro now. So it's my pleasure to welcome George Warren, Anglian Water, to this webinar. And George, over to you to make your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us at this session to listen to me speak about my passion. Hopefully you're all enjoying your lunch. And if at times we'd start talking about sewage, apologies in advance. It's never nice whilst having your lunch. So as David said, I'm George Warren. I'm the Integrated Water Manager at Anglian Water. And in terms of what I'm going to speak to you today about, so I'll briefly touch on who I am, what Anglian Water do, the challenges that are facing the water sector. Then we'll go on to what I see as integrated water management, touch on some current projects, and then probably focus in on a rather large project called Enabling Water Smart Communities before bringing it to a close. There is a danger here that I'm teaching certain people on this line to suck eggs, and apologies in advance if that is the case. It's very hard to know exactly what the level of understanding around these areas are. I'm also very aware of the fact there's probably people on here that are far more knowledgeable about certain aspects of what I'm going to talk about. So please be gentle with me, and apologies in advance if I do make any faux pas, but I will try not to. So who the hell am I? Why the hell am I speaking to you today? So I started off having graduated with an engineering master's degree in consultancy, writing flood risk assessments and water-based master plans and the likes, working on big developments like the London Olympics and Tottenham Hotspur's new stadium. That was a fair while ago, before moving across to Australia, where I worked with ACOM and got more involved in what's known as SUDS and integrated water management. I returned to the UK and came into the public sector, where I managed the lead local flooding authority at Hammersmith and Fulham Council, and was successful in delivering numerous numbers of large SUD schemes, which were award-winning, in fact, before moving on to the Greater London Authority, where I headed up surface water management and SUDS retrofit across London, and then returned home to my, I guess, my boyhood home in the Anglian region, where I've been for the last 2 years, leading on integrated water management. So a somewhat varied career to date. I still believe it's in its infancy, but hopefully you can see there's a mix there of private, public, and semi. I'm going to say quasi-private in terms of water. So who are Anglian Water? And again, there will no doubt be people on this call who are very aware, but we are the biggest geographic water company in England. Out of the 11, sorry, we serve almost 7 million people across the east of England, and we encompass about 20% of England and over 1,200 kilometres of coastline and numerous rivers across the piece. So what's the water company, water cycle? And again, there'll be lots of people on here who work within water, but for those who don't, just to be clear, so this water company abstracts water either from reservoirs and river or from groundwater, and we are about 50% of both. both groundwater and surface waters in that respect. We treat that to a world-class standard, and then for a pressurized system, deliver it to properties, both residential and non-residential. We then also collect that water as we're a drainage undertaker, and through the joys of gravity on the whole, although given a flat region we do end up having to pump a fair bit, we then take it to treatment works where we then treat it before then discharging it to the environment, either through into inland waterways or into coastal, into tidal waterways. Despite what you may read in the press, and don't get me wrong, the press have been gunning for us alongside the public of late. We actually, Anglian Water, we incorporated our purpose within our Articles of Association several years back. And I genuinely believe this isn't just a tagline when I say that we are about the community and the environment before profit. And that is the way in which the organisation is practicing at present, and long may it continue. So yeah, it's important to make that point, I think. So the challenges, geez, where do I start on the challenges? Could I just ask, there's certain people that I'm getting some feedback, so if everyone could place themselves on mute, please, that would be grand. So in terms of the challenges, I mean, it's like although we're only a small region of England, in fairness, we face some truly global challenges. So whether that be risks of flooding, both in terms of increased intensity of rainfall, but also sea level rise, being a fairly large coastal areas. We're also the driest region. We have about 2/3 of the average rainfall across the UK. In fact, drier than Jerusalem, which is often catches people by surprise. But we're also one of the fastest growing regions outside of the southeast. So we have, although we have 7 million customers, we have 5 of the fastest growing cities across the UK. Sorry, 3 of the 5 fastest growing cities, and we're expecting a population increase of around 1 million people over the next 25 years, and that's quite a large growth, as you can imagine. So those pressures on demand are only going to increase, and our availability of water is decreasing fast. That's mainly down to the presence of our time-limited licenses. So I mentioned before how 50% of the water is abstracted from groundwater, and many of those abstraction licenses are time-limited. Although we've planned for a reduction in those abstraction licenses in the last round of our business planning back in WRP 19 and PR 19, that has the rules changed somewhat over the last few years in terms of what the licenses will be capped to, which has led to a huge decrease. That, alongside judicial reviews that have happened around the Norfolk Broads, are leading to further restrictions. So a huge decrease in the amount of deployable output that we can put together. It's also worth pointing out that that's us saying it from a water company perspective. There are a lot of other abstractors who are facing exactly the same issues. So you can imagine golf courses, agriculture and the likes, all suddenly finding themselves with an abstraction license that is heavily reduced from prior rates. And as you might imagine, their first port of call is to turn to the water company. And unfortunately, at the present time, the water company, well, we don't have a huge amount of water spare. In fact, the majority of our region is in deficit in that respect. In fact, even the blue area and the northern part around Kings Lynn, I've been informed as I was pulling this together that is actually now out of date, and that should be considered to be red. At the present time, we actually have a deficit come 2050 in those regions, and that basically means we don't have access to enough water to supply what we anticipate the demand to be in 2050, and that's a real stress for a large portion of our company. There are lots of schemes going in place to help address this, but in terms of the reductions, this is in line with the Environment Act as well. So what's known as per capita consumption as in what an individual person might use on a litre per person per day basis. We have certain targets within the Environment Act to meet. Now we're currently at just over 130 in our region, which is actually very low from a national perspective, but we need to get down to 122 within the next few years, which is going to be hard. And that, bear in mind that that's an average across existing and new build, with an aim to get to 110 by 2050. We've also got on us a requirement to reduce non-household, so anything that's not residential, by 9%. That's made very tricky through the presence of water retailers. So we no longer have non-household customers. They several years back they became a retail market. So Anglian Water do not serve directly non-residential customers. We don't bill them, I should say. We still provide the water to them. We're a wholesaler in that regard. So we actually don't have the control over the communications with our non-household customers. And therefore, it's quite hard to start looking at 9% reduction. To add to that, that 9% reduction is on a baseline of 2020. So any future growth is working against that. And so with large new demands coming online, whether that be through them turning from previously abstraction licenses to public water supply, or potentially growth as we're seeing in large areas of our region, especially around hydrogen production and the likes, that has quite large water demands, and that obviously counts against and working in the opposite direction from that 9%. So that is going to be a real stress for the water sector going forward as to how to address that alongside residential demand reductions. And then we also have a leakage reduction target. Now I appreciate that the graphs I put on here are very small and it's almost impossible for you to read. But what you'll see on the right hand side potentially is one of the dots. In fact, I don't know if you can see my mouse, possibly not, but the Anglian Water are below the orange curve, which is the target. We're certainly on track with regards to leakage reduction and leading the way in many respects. But because they take it as a 2020 baseline, those that have been putting a lot of effort into leakage reduction are almost penalised. The low-hanging fruit is gone. We have grabbed that and we've had some. And we are now having to do a 20% reduction on our existing, right, rather than a 20% reduction on average across the nation. So that's a real struggle, and it will be to try and reduce that down as we've made huge headway when it comes to leakage reduction, and it's almost penalising us going forward. It all sounds very doom and gloom, doesn't it? And I've used the term jaws of death here, which some of you may be familiar with. Sir James Bevan, the previous chief executive of the Environment Agency, used it several years back at a Waterwise conference when talking about the supply-demand curve for water companies, and it really is starting to hit. And hopefully that gets across quite how we're not talking decades away. We're actually talking in the next few years where we'll start to get to a point where actually the water that we're able to take from the environment, and I should point out, we have no desire to take more than we are, anything that's going to have a detrimental impact, but we are not going to be able to supply our existing demands, let alone future growth. And that's a real issue. You add to that all the population growth, and we do have a requirement to meet to fulfill the requirement of residential growth, but our comments often are along the lines of, we can do, but we need enough time to be able to get the infrastructure in place to do so. The sort of infrastructure that we're talking about, maybe people on this line will be more familiar than I, in fact, of a new strategic pipeline that brings water down from what was previously considered to be our wetter areas, where there was surplus at the time from North Lincolnshire, down to areas of significant growth and drier areas. So bringing that down all the way into sort of Colchester area in the Cambridge parts there where there was greater demand. It's We refer to it in Anglian Water as SPA because it's delivered by a Strategic Pipeline Alliance doing so. We're majority of the way through that, and that will be coming into play in the next couple of years in true earnest. You also may be familiar with or have seen reports of 2 new reservoirs being proposed. And these are very large water bodies, which will hopefully help to address some of that shortfall. But they do take a long time. So if all goes well, they may be online by 2040. So these things do take a long time in the planning process, and we have to. We can't put them in without an understanding of actually the need for them, and yet, as you can imagine, growth figures don't tend to spread out to 2050 and beyond, because the housing developers don't necessarily know what land availability they might have to them, or businesses aren't aware of necessarily how much they want to grow in 2050, for instance. So it's a really hard game to try and balance out those the demands and water resource availability. But it's a real need, though. We can see even with existing things that we're going to, in order to reduce down our abstractions from groundwater, we definitely need these new surface water resources. Apologies, I'm speaking really quickly, but I'm very aware of the fact that I've got lots of slides. So hopefully you can still hear me and I'm not garbling on too much. I'll briefly touch on the issues around nutrient neutrality, which hopefully people have heard of, and maybe some people on the line are very aware of. But under the habitats regulations, competent authorities such as local planning authorities and the Environment Agency must assess the environmental impact of projects and plans, such as planning applications and local plans, which affect habitat sites. And local planning authorities can only approve a project if they're sufficiently certain they'll have no negative impact or effect, I should say, on the site's conditions. As a result of these regulations and domestic European case law, Natural England issued advice for 31 habitat sites spanning 27 catchments and a total of 74 local planning authorities, advice to say that basically these sites are in an unfavourable condition due to excess nutrient pollution. And projects and plans may only go ahead if the increase in wastewater that is produced by this human population increases from developments will not cause additional pollution. So ultimately, it's unless you can demonstrate how you're reducing the amount of nutrients that are generated by a new development, you aren't able to develop. Now, in our region, that has hit Norfolk, and it may not necessarily stop there. This is a case across large parts of the country, as I say, with 74 of those local planning authorities taking this at the present time. And the water company are part of helping to deliver some of the solutions for it. We're not responsible for it per se, but one way developers can demonstrate the projects will not cause it is through the delivery of nutrient neutrality, and whether that's through additional treatment at existing WRCs, water recycling centres, or better known as sewage treatment works, or capturing runoff off roads and treating that. Also working with agriculture, which is probably the other large player for nutrient loading within our water courses. There's no silver bullet to addressing nutrient neutrality, and it is quite bespoke to the individual cases. You have to do it upstream of the development, for instance. And I think we've recently established a joint venture with local planning authorities to find a way of being able to offset and provide nutrient credits for development to enable it to go ahead. You may well have seen it's become a bit of a political hot potato, shall we say, and one that's been banned. There's lots of talks of abandoning it and the likes. I don't see this being abandoned anytime soon, and I think that we, as a water company, alongside agriculture and others, need to work together in trying to address these issues. And then the elephant in the room, combined sewer overflows. So this has dominated large parts of the industry of late in trying to address it. And that's let's be clear here, storm overflows and sewage treatment should not damage our environment. They were designed for the right reasons in the past, but it's not necessarily a 21st century answer to these issues. And so we're investing a lot of money. In fact, over 100 million investment into storm tanks and 800 million in our WINEP program, which is our environment program, to try and address this. We've installed over 1,000 monitoring devices to understand it better, and we'll have full coverage by the end of this calendar year. And then how do we actually try to remove the amount of surface water getting into that system to ensure that actually the frequency of those CSOs, or even they don't spill at all? It's really clear these CSOs do not operate because of sewage flows. They only operate because of the additional flows coming in after a rainfall event. Now, there will be various news reports and certain ex-rock stars who tweet about this, who suggest that actually they flow continuously. That is often down to the fact that people have slowed the flow upstream, and so there's a consistent flow of water from rainfall coming down. There may well be blockages as well, caused by unflushables being flushed down the system, and leading to backlogs and pressure buildup, and therefore an action of those CSOs. Ultimately, we have to understand the system far better, and it's fair to say that the wastewater system has not had the level of investment that it possibly needed in order to reduce this down. And we're very clear that we are addressing this, and we are doing everything we can to do so. And hopefully you'll see that in the coming years, as improvements are made. And we obviously, like I say, we are investing a lot of money. We've got into a joint venture or a collaborative account with Severn Trent Water and a Get River Positive campaign, which you can see the commitments there. Okay, so that was all doom and gloom. But hopefully there's some rays of sunshine coming through, and I see actually it sets it up very nicely for integrated water management to come to the fore. So I think the way in which I see integrated water management is probably, if you take it back to school days where they initially talked to you about the water cycle, and it's trying to join that up a bit better. I think for a long period, and in fact, it still happens. We look at things through very much a single lens, and we look at water resources, and we assume it needs to be a potable standard and provide everything to a potable standard for a water resources perspective. And then we have other colleagues who will look at wastewater, and then we'll have other colleagues that look at the environmental impacts. Now, I need to look at all of that under one piece. I need to join up the water cycle far better, and see how development can play a part in that. And that's my role ostensibly. I think it's the fun bit, if truth be told. Now, I could go through what the dictionary definition of integrated water management is, but I think that would probably bore you to a certain degree. And quite frankly, I'm sure putting it into Chat GPT would do the trick nicely for you. But it's not just about physical interventions. It's about different stewardship models and looking at how you might be able to meet certain demands with certain with certain qualities. Okay, so I think that you can approach IWM at the different scales. So whether that be on an individual household basis, whether that through capturing your rainwater for reuse in your garden, whether that be on a development scale where you're capturing all the rainwater within centralized systems to then reuse within properties or around the grounds of within the public realm, potentially capturing the grey water, which is the water that comes off your showers and basins with no fecal matter in it, for reuse for non-potable standards. But it also can be looked at from a regional perspective. How do you capture flood waters and reuse them? How can you recharge aquifers at the right places in order to be able to abstract them? It really is, the scale is endless in many respects. And it's and I sit in many respects as aligning those hierarchies. We've looked at drainage, for instance, and at the top of the drainage hierarchy, certainly in the London Plan, which I may have had a behind writing these policies, but at the top is around reuse, and sometimes that's forgotten, if truth be told. And the water neutrality hierarchy, which some people may be familiar with, is really pushing on reuse. And I think I probably see the main thing of integrated water management that is missing at the minute is around that reuse element. But first on that scale is reducing it. We need to reduce the amount of water that we are using in the first place. So we have a policy within Anglian Water's region. In fact, we came out with a joint statement back in 2019 together with Environment Agency and Natural England that we are a water stressed area, and therefore all new planning applications should be meeting 110 litres per person per day. That was adopted by 54 out of the 59 local planning authorities. The reason that 5 of them haven't adopted it to date is mainly to do with the fact they haven't updated their local plans since that date. So they require new development to meet 110 litres per person per day or less. However, it's not policed. It's one of many policies in a local plan that a developer needs to meet. They can say they're meeting it, but no one checks it. And Welsh Water Study, that they looked into this and found that actually out of the 80 properties they looked at, not a single one delivered at 110. In fact, it averaged over 140 litres per person per day, with some of them being as high as 190. And this is when they have had a policy that they were trying to meet of 110. And that I don't believe that developers are doing this on purpose. I think this is down to a lack of information that's out there around flow rates of taps, basins, and the likes, and toilets, and maybe just I guess the messaging gets lost in the procurement process. That could easily be addressed through the water label, which is due to come in, has been due to come in for a very long time, I might add. But having some clarity over water consumption of each individual fixture and fitting will certainly help developers choose the right product. And I say developers, but also us as householders and customers going forward. When it comes to replacing our dishwasher, saying how much water it uses may well come into your thinking at the point of purchase. So what are we doing about it? Well, we've just commenced a project, Project 110. It's an awful name, I appreciate, but effectively we are trying to look at actually how many of these developers, or how many developments I should say, are meeting the 110 litres per person per day. If we were to go in there and measure the fixtures and fittings, what flow rates are coming out, and then it's not a case of us getting their wrists and slapping them on it. It's saying, do you know what, you may not be aware, and I'm sure you haven't done this on purpose, but your shower and your kitchen tap, for instance, are not meeting the flow rates that would enable a standard person to be able to use 110 or less per day. Let's have a conversation with your procurement team and identify potential products that might meet that to enable these developments going forward to meet that. It's not a case of going in there and ripping out new fixtures and fittings. It's a case of the next development of the block to make sure that the right taps, showers and the likes are used. And yeah, we've targeted 280 residential properties, which is 1% of our residential growth each year in our region. And we'll be looking at a mixture of scales of development, as well as mixture of developers. We hope that through the course of this and providing that value add service with developers and working closely with them, that we can help to at least move the dial down in terms of new development to 110 or less. And then obviously we have the existing housing stock, which we can then look at around retrofitting. And this aligns with the environmental improvement plan, which actually is saying that they're aspiring towards 100 litres per person per day for new development, and we're actually working on a joint protocol with around the Cambridge area around providing that information as to how you get down to 100 or 80 litres per person per day. I would suggest that 100 litres can be done with fixtures and fittings alone. 80 starts to bring in an element of reuse. Which kind of brings me on to reuse, and how are we doing for time? Okay, in terms of reuse, I'd say there's 3 main areas. So one would be to capture the rainwater. So if you capture off the roofs only, then it's referred to as rainwater harvesting. If you capture off the roofs and hard surfaces, so whether that be roads, footways, and the likes, then that starts to be referred to as stormwater harvesting or surface water harvesting. I appreciate ostensibly they're the same thing, just if you were to capture off roads and hard surfaces, there may be additional pollutants that are added to it. Grey water recycling takes it from showers and basins, basically anything without any fats or greases or fecal matter. So you wouldn't take it from your kitchen tap, kitchen sink, but you would take it from your hand basins. Now that obviously has a fairly regular supply of water and is not dependent upon climate, but it provides, on average, your residential properties tend to have a similar amount of grey water produced as you would need for a non-potable supply. So you would take that grey water or that storm water I was doing and use it for the flushing of toilets. You can use it in washing machines and outdoor taps, for instance. And that tends to marry up with the grey water that's produced. The grey water is produced on a residential building. Obviously, it does vary depending on how much showering you do or little, but yeah, on basis of that. And a very regular water supply would be black water recycling. It's not done particularly prevalently because, truth be told, people don't like the sound of it particularly. This is where you take full foul water, sewage ostensibly, and treat it to a standard that we can use for non-potable sources. Something that's kind of, and I'll get onto it in a second, a piece of work that we're looking around final effluent reuse. So that's not, in backwater recycling tends to refer to kind of almost a new package plant that developments might be able to incorporate within buildings, whereas final effluent reuse would probably be using existing water recycling centres or sewage treatment works and taking the effluent from those for reuse. But those are the three major sources. There are other sources, whether that be sort of blow down water or things on an industrial scale that could be used there. But those are the three main when it comes to residential properties. Then I think you've determined what the source of water is, and then it's the scale of collection. So from a rainwater perspective, or even a grey water perspective, to possibly not black, you would look at, okay, is it on an individual plot? So do you capture the rainwater that lands on a particular house and reuse it in a house, or do you do it on development scale? Do you capture the rainwater that lands across the development, take it to a centralized point, treat it, to provide any treatment that you might need, and then pump it back? Or actually, do you do it on a community scale, so on a regional basis? Do you end up having new pipelines of non-potable water? And that might sound crazy to the UK at the minute, but you have large other countries across the world where there are non-potable pipelines that provide water to residential or non-residential developments. And I think that we're probably getting to a point where that may well become more prevalent in the UK. There are developments, I should say, that do incorporate that within our region. So we're in particular around the Cambridge area. And then in terms of the usage, I think I explained that typically people use it for external uses, whether that be for irrigation or sweetening of flows to water features and the likes, or internally they would tend to use it for WC flushing or washing machines. And then there is obviously a large demand around the commercial space, whether that be for cooling or for use in transportation of products within industrial setting. And there seems to be a large demand on that side going forward. So some of the other little projects that we're working on around this space is around converting standard stormwater tanks or surface water attenuation, which tends to be delivered in development for flood risk purposes. These tanks tend to be effectively dumb. They just discharge at a slow rate, whether that be through a hydro break or an orifice plate or the likes. They are designed to discharge at a very slow rate to lop off the peak of those flows coming downstream, so to help reduce flood risk. But this is a large tank capturing water that then just slowly discharges, and yet you will have hopefully been on the line when 20 minutes ago I explained how we've got a real issue when it comes to water resources. This feels like an opportunity missed, and so we're looking at how we can convert large stormwater tanks to smart tanks. What that effectively means is that they will store that water. There'll be no water going out unless these little gizmos speak to weather forecasting data, unless they can see that rainwater is arriving and there is insufficient capacity within the tank to hold the necessary water. What they'll do in those instances is purge the right amount of water ahead of those storm events to free up that capacity to ensure that it can still provide that flood risk benefit. What it means essentially is that it is as full as it possibly can be for reuse purposes. Now there's various products out there, and we will be trialing several of them, but I feel as though this is, we've got the infrastructure, the majority of the infrastructure in place in terms of the attenuation aspects, and then it's just how do we then join the dots between the potential supply of water and the users, and so we're trialing some aspects on that going forward. In a similar vein, for those of you, you may recognise the picture there. That is from Shawshank Redemption. That's Andy Vane crawling through the sewer to escape prison. Well, I think the majority of prisons have wised up to this, and majority of prisons are served by that do not have large surface water pipes exiting them. They're very small ones, and it's all combined sewer. But the rainwater does all go through it, which does, it means that there is a large amount of surface water going through our combined sewer, which ultimately we'd like to disconnect. Right? So we're working with a particular prison at the minute, looking at how we could capture that rainwater for reuse for irrigation of their polytunnels, which they've created on site. These brand new polytunnels to produce fresh produce for use within the prison, but also any excess to be donated to the local food bank is the proposal at the present time. They also have created a tree nursery on this particular prison on the basis that there is a large demand for new trees going forward, and so the water will be used for both irrigating the polytunnels and the trees. The inmates will be part of the process in terms of upskilling them with green skills, and it obviously then leads to potential job opportunities going forward, as there will be a great demand for skills around irrigation and green skills are basically going forward. So it's a great piece of work actually that with the Ministry of Justice, and the potential to then roll that out further. And then final effluent reuse. I'm fast running out of time, David, so I'll try and crack on quickly with these ones. This is just a realisation there's a large number of water recycling centres across Anglian region, and they treat water to a fairly good standard and then discharge it into the water bodies. Some of those water bodies need that flow. Not all of them do. Not all of them need all of that flow, I should say, as well. So what we're looking at is how we might be able to reuse that water for other localized non-potable uses, and one of those being golf course irrigation. Golf courses, 65% of golf courses use public main water supply to irrigate, and their irrigation demands are quite astronomical. Actually, their water demands are quite large in summer months in particular. And we did a small sort of mapping study where we identified there's a large number of golf courses where there's potential for reuse, and with 68 of them within 1 kilometre, for instance, of a WRC. The problem is, at the minute, it's considered to be a waste product. So as soon as we don't put it into the water body, it needs a waste transfer licence and a permit in order to use it. And there's so much red tape around it. And yet we think it's quite a valuable resource. And so we're in the process of trying to establish a national working group on this to try and apply some standard methodology for whether it's available or not. Because at the present time, if you are a golf course and you're interested in it, you probably approach the water company, and as a water company say, okay, great, we do have to take a little bit of money off you to run through the numbers, but before you do that, go and speak to the Environment Agency and make sure that they're happy. And the Environment Agency say, yeah, great, we need to take a little bit of money off you too. We don't know when we'll come back to you with the information. We will do, and this golf course or whoever is interested, whether it be agriculture and horticulture, leisure facility, has no idea what the answer is going to be, because it's so opaque in terms of the process, and they could be several thousands of pounds down before they find out what the answer is going to be. We think it needs to be far more transparent. They should be able to see whether there is actually final effluent potentially available at that from that potential source, that water recycling centre. And so we'd like to establish a national methodology for assessing that, and then make that that sort of grading of that WRC available so that people can see, and then it allows people to know whether it's available, but also for us to be proactive as well in areas where we do have it. This isn't new. If truth be told, this has been done throughout the world for decades, but it just isn't really being done in the UK. There are a couple of examples of it, but it's few and far between, and it's very hard to get off the line. But we think it needs to be seen as a really valuable resource. Okay, now I'm going to. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour, but I think the slides will be shared afterwards, so it may be something to look at afterwards. But this is a very major project that we're working on at the minute, which we started back last July. In fact, I think it is actually a year to the day that we started this project. It's been funded through the Ofwat Innovation Fund, the Water Breakthrough Challenge, through the Transform stream, and it's all about basically how do we break down the barriers to integrated water management within new residential developments. It's quite a complex cross-sector, multi-stakeholder project. And in fact, it's limiting innovative, has innovative delivery of integrated water management, I should say. I will flick through the slides fairly quickly, and apologies in advance because I've massively run out of time. But these are the partners involved. So 4 major water companies on there. We've got a number of different funded partners and supporting partners, and we have an independent programme board made up of some key regulators, academia, key partners within the development cycle, and a number of integrated water management expertise as well. I suppose the 3 kind of key areas to take away, we've split this down into 3 major areas in value, assets, and stewardship, or roles. We think that those unpacking those are going to be really key to solving this issue, and in the process providing that new evidence in order to do so. I mentioned that there's 4 major water companies in this, and we believe that actually you need to look at through development in 4 different ways. So I think typically when people talk about development, they tend to focus in on private and think of the large home builders, but actually there's a large amount of housing that's built through public sector funds, and if you imagine that, this is very generic, but private sector tend to be about capital expenditure. So get in there, build the houses. They want an exit strategy. It's about how much money is spent up front. Public sector has more of a long-term aspiration. Yes, it's about how much it costs up front, but actually there's an operational expenditure which they'll be bearing. So, they need to understand the whole life costs of it, and they're more of a long-term stewardship perspective. Community-led is really on the rise in terms of developments going forward. They are the ones that are going to be living. So it's a mix of the capital expenditure and the operational, but it's also the quality of the product that's being delivered. So they have a slightly different focus in on development. And the 4th one is an interesting lens. We're saying, well, given everything that's going forward and the need for water and wastewater provisions and development, what role does the water sector now have in terms of shaping and facilitating development going forward? We've divvied that up across those 4 water companies. It's not saying that Anglian aren't interested in community or public sector, for instance. It's just trying to deliver those across, and those in those 4 areas will be delivering demonstrators associated with those particular sectors. We are just coming to the end of our discovery phase, and we will be going into the delivery phase, develop and deliver phases shortly. We have a very complex model, which, we've identified those 3 assets: stewardship and value, and we're taking those forward into a framework where we will then be looking, and we developed a load of insights through this. So at the present, in the last couple of weeks, the project team have been reviewing somewhere between 20 and 30 papers, of ranging from small ones around 300 words to 3,000 word pieces from our partners, and pulling those together to try and pull out the major insights from those, which has not been easy, as we've had a mix from the Netherlands, from Italy, from Hong Kong, and the likes, pulling it into it together. We've created this framework where it kind of chimes with my conversations before around the scale, whether it be on individual plot basis, development, or beyond, and looking at how each of these things form part of it. I appreciate I'm not describing this particularly well here, but hopefully when you get to see these slides, it might make more sense when you get to the chance to read through them. But we're looking at how everything is positioned and how things influence each other as they go forward. I won't dwell on that too long, but yeah, and these insights have all been placed within that framework. I suppose if I just touch briefly on each of these elements, so what's up here is kind of showing you the ecosystem of different actors across this piece around water. There are a lot of them, and everyone holds different values in that respect, and yet there are, there's dozens, if not almost hundreds of different actors, and yet there's probably only a handful of actors that really have an impact on this in terms of the change in delivery, and that's been really interesting, kind of mapping that out and looking at people's different values. When we started to break that down in terms of water resources, wastewater and surface water, who kind of influences what has been, it kind of starts to unpack who's going to drive on what aspects, and how do we align values, because ultimately by aligning values, actually we can start moving in the right direction together. And then looking at it from an assets perspective, saying that actually there's a number of different layers in this, and I think for too long we've looked at them individually, or only a few of them at a time, and how do we pull that together to look at them all under one umbrella, and then looking at across different scales, and that's been quite difficult, because for those that are involved in housing delivery or developments, you'll know that it is looked at individually, and those that are responsible for kind of coming up with the yield aren't necessarily the yield from that development aren't necessarily responsible for the delivery of the drainage, for instance. And then on the stewardship perspective, and this is about sort of long-term ownership, and whose responsibility. I think what's quite clear from the dozens of interviews that we've taken place across this is that actually, there's a lot, people are aware of what they should and could do, very aware of what they must do, and quite often you can come together with other organisations and partner, on some of those could or should do aspects. But as soon as in times of stress, everyone pulls back out and only concentrates on what the core things that they have to do. And unless you start pulling together a multi-party governance arrangement around those, what might be considered to be nice to haves, actually they quite often don't get delivered as a result of the stresses in the system. And so it's how we can create that long-term stewardship angle to look around that blue-green infrastructure and reuse aspects. And in terms of what we're likely to be demonstrating, and this is very much preliminary feedback on the basis of we're still going through and digesting all the insights. I think it's probably fair to say that we will be concentrating quite a lot on water reuse. So looking at different stewardship models, looking at different scales of delivery in that create different values. And I guess important and probably most interesting to this meeting is around efficient pipe sizing. So there's the design and construction guidance stipulates a minimum pipe size diameter for waste structure, and yet we're talking about a reduction with reuse. We're talking about quite a heavy reduction in terms of waste water produced. Certainly stuff in the Netherlands and in Brazil have found that when developments where they use smaller pipe sizes, actually they've resulted in less blockages as a result of that, the flows that go through it, and obviously you can have significant cost savings and efficiencies of pumping the likes as a result of that. So we're going to play around with some, pilot some alternative pipe sizing arrangements on developments to see what the savings could be and the more efficiencies on that. And this ultimately is not just supposed to be a standalone project where everything then sits on the shelf afterwards. We are looking at that transition. We're heavily involved in feeding in to the plan for water and the government's proposals on that. But how does this become part of general conversation? Can this influence development going forward is really key. I probably have not described this particularly well. And so apologies in advance if it all sounds like a load of hot air at the minute, but yeah, it comes to an end in December 2025. There's some really interesting stuff that'll be coming out on the website very shortly. I would encourage you to have a look at it. I appreciate that people are coming from all parts of the industry in that respect, but you could probably see where your part of the industry plays a role. And yeah, have a look and follow us on LinkedIn and social media. That's stated there. You'll see the stuff that's coming out. I appreciate that I've left an almighty 8 minutes. It was not intentional, David. Apologies. I haven't been able to keep up with the chat. So maybe if I stop sharing and then I can have a look at the chat in that respect. Maybe you could tell me whether there's been huge criticism in the chat of my presentation.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much, George. It's been absolutely fascinating presentation, a huge sort of complex project which you've taken us through in a fairly limited period of time. We do have a number of questions, not a huge number, but we do have a few minutes to go through them. So the first one is first question from Ewan Innes. The planned reservoirs have about 50 megalitre capacity each. What are the increases in SDB? And I'm not sure what SDB, but I guess it's sustainable yield, probably in megalitres per day of potable water, I guess.
I'll be honest, Ewan, I don't know, but I am sure my colleagues do. So if Ewan, can I appreciate this sounds like a massive cop out, but I can't be over absolutely everything, but I would imagine it's a fairly high percentage. But can I take that question away? And I assume, David, that we have Ewan's contact details, and can we get back to him?
Yeah, we do.
On that
yeah.
point? And apologies,
So,
it's just it's one project of many projects across Anglian Water, and I'm not across absolutely all the details of it.
Yeah. I know the young lady that will know the answer, actually, Alexa Sherry, who did a presentation a couple of weeks ago.
I was going to suggest the same. So yeah.
Question is from myself. I should recognise this. We tend to take potable water for granted, but is it the case that water is perhaps undervalued in a water-stressed area such as the east of England?
Well, I think it's very much undervalued. I think there's a key point here that I think you have to separate the value that people place on water and the cost of water. So I think even if you were to double the cost of water, it wouldn't necessarily place a greater value that people place on it. I think the point at which people place value on it is almost a situation, for instance, in South Africa, in Cape Town, where they were coming fast approaching day zero, where there wasn't water. And parts of North America right now are experiencing it, and South America for that matter, and Uruguay, where actually when you realise that it may not necessarily, when you turn on that tap, it's not going to be necessarily available. That's when you start to really value it. I think, sadly, the cost of water is very low, which means that people aren't necessarily, if they run the hose into their new swimming pool, or, refill and empty their swimming pool, paddling pool, hot tub, or whatever it might be, they place the cost in and they go, well, it's probably worth that. We're happy to pay that. Well, actually, the cost does not provide an incentive to reduce demand. There's some interesting things that are going on across the industry at the minute around variable tariffs that may well mean that your sort of core water use, core water demands are fairly low value, fairly low cost, I should say, but that increases quite dramatically if you start using excess water. Now that may well start to be in a position where actually encourages people to use less. I think that we're talking on a household basis. I think from a business perspective, actually, they tend to be quite acute about their water usage and fairly, familiar with what they're using. What isn't clear, though, is the decisions around where they locate their businesses, where there's certain water-hungry devices. For instance, a brewery is very water hungry or thirsty. Placing a brewery in a water-stressed area possibly isn't the greatest idea. Or certain elements of our hydrogen economy, upcoming hydrogen economy, probably not best placed in our water stressed areas. So I think the locations of where certain businesses are located should be considered. Water should be considered at the forefront. There's quite a number of businesses that only approach the water company very late in the day, once all their other stuff has been sorted, and go, can we have a connection? Not realising that actually we can't just turn it on and off, so quickly. So I would say that the value placed in people's psyche is probably quite low in terms of water. And sadly, what tends to happen is people only really start placing value on it when there's a shortage of it. We don't want to get to that point, but I think there's things that we can do in order to encourage it better.
Lovely, thanks, George. Actually, Ewan has clarified that SDB means supply-demand balance, so it's not what I thought it was. So it's basically so
basically the reservoirs mean that our supply-demand balance then comes in line, but that's on the basis of projected growth from a residential perspective. What we have no foresight for is around the non-residential side of it. That will get us to a point where we have some surplus, but not huge amounts of surplus. We can't go and use customer money to build too bigger reservoirs on the off chance there might be growth going forward. So we have to build it with a certain amount of foresight in terms of what's coming forward, but not so big that it allows us to sit on our laurels for the next 100 years. So it is still very clear that even with reservoirs going ahead, we still have to drive down existing consumption.
And Ewan has come up with another question, actually. The Anglian WRMP, I forget what it stands for. You know,
Water Resource Management Plan.
1 in 500 chance, I think, is a probability. 1 in 500 deficit of 443 megalitres per day by mid-century. That seems very challenging to meet. Is it likely the proposed schemes will close the gap?
It will close the gap, but not alone. There's a huge focus, and I mean, Ewan, if truth be told, your knowledge of the WRMP and this probably exceeds mine at the present time. But I'm very aware of the fact that there is still a large increase on the case of water demand reduction, basically. So that's leakage. That's the use of smart metering data to identify where leakage is occurring on that property basis. That is a case of greater efficiencies in our processes, and then also working with end users to try and drive down that consumption. Also influencing where development occurs. So yes, we can move water across the region, but ideally what you do is you have the demand in the areas that you have the supply. So influencing where growth occurs, where there's capacity. And that may sound like a water company trying to hold back from investing in its infrastructure. That's not the case. It's a more sustainable solution. You know, otherwise you are pumping things across, whether it be water or that wastewater, and you're moving it across the region, which obviously has a huge carbon footprint associated with it. So, you know, if we can influence where development takes place on the basis of where capacity is, then it leads to more sustainable growth.
Lovely. Thanks, George. Well, that's very timely, because I have actually, oh, another question, one final question from Ewan. He works for Scottish Water.
Well, enjoy Mr. Plant.
New CEO just come over from Anglian.
Yeah, so Alex Plant has recently taken on the chief exec role of, he used to be my boss, in fact, my manager.
Who's that, Alex?
Alex Plant. So
right,
he has recently moved over to be chief exec, and that's a massitive coup for Scottish Water. He's fantastic.
So Ian said, I work for Scottish Water, so I knew he has come over from England, so I thought it's worth having a read of your plans.
Well, fair enough. Well, you've obviously studied them to a good degree. Thank you, Ewan.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. Absolutely fascinating presentation on there, and it's sort of, on the one side, it's sort of a bit of the doom thing, isn't it? You say, with the jaws of death or something. But on the other hand, yes, you know, there are ways that we can see our way out of this. So excellent.
I hope so. I hope so.
All the best with your work, which sounds very, very interesting, and perhaps we'll invite you back for an update in a year or two's time, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I've solved it all, right? Let's give it a go, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely.
All right,
anyway, thank you very much, George. Thank you to everyone that attended, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Cheers.